Hello and welcome to the webinar Stability Challenges the Southern Cone in Times of COVID-19. My name is Irene. I'm a Senior Fellow for Latin America and Country Security and Development at the IISS. Our Latin American program focuses on actionable research and policy insight in regional resilience. And we look at the issue of security, governance, geopolitics, and geoeconomics. I'm very happy today to have a very distinguished panel of guests with me and friends. We were going to look at the many challenges that the pandemic has brought about for Latin America and the Southern Cone, challenges of economic, political, and social stability nature. What we were trying to do in this webinar really, it's looking at the challenges, but also trying to identify best practices and solutions for rebuilding regional resilience, and also to look at new development models for the region, given we have seen that the pandemic has highlighted the structural problems with the existing one in the region. The webinar builds on the findings of a research we have published in November. Title was COVID-19 in the Battle Against Poverty in the Southern Cone. That was a research part of a series looking at the ways in which COVID has impacted stability across the world. A research project which was supported by PMI Impact, which we thank for the support. So before I let our speaker start the conversation, I just wanted to give you a couple of introduction on the webinar. As we know, Latin America has been the region which has been hit the worst by the pandemic in the world, against the backdrop of high informality, very high level of urbanization, underdeveloped and social security nets, and also fragmented and underfunded healthcare system. The human and economic tolls of the pandemic for the region has been enormous. The region is expected to have contracted by over 7% last year, the worst recession in recent history. And the regional output for the region won't go back to pre-pandemic level until 2023. GDP per capita will go back only by 2025, which is later than any other region in the world. If we look at the human toll of the pandemic, that has been similarly dramatic. Around 22 million people infected just in Southern America, 30 million only in Brazil. I mean, the news are quite dramatic if you look at the Brazil situation at the moment. Brazil is actually the second in the world, unfortunately, for the number of deaths, with 340,000 as of today. But also Mexico is number two. Mexico is outside the southern cone, but still is the second, the country with the second human toll after third human toll after the US and Brazil. The region is currently facing a second wave of COVID-19 without having really emerged from the first wave. We're seeing everywhere news on Brazil, but also countries like Uruguay, which previously have been have been actually doing quite well, and now are seeing a new wave of pandemic. Chile is in lockdown again, as Andrés will tell us. The situation is still quite dramatic. The vaccine rollout is underway, but it's proceeding slowly, and won't probably be completed in some of the country in the region until end of next year, probably. While the region is rebounding from the recession, from the deep recession of last year, it is emerging from the shock with very deep fiscal scars. Also, linked to the fact that the region has intervened quite forcefully against the pandemic with fiscal stimulus last year. Also, social indicators have deteriorated with rising level of poverty and unemployment. This development will compound ongoing challenges to social and political stability in the region, with crime rates and social unrest already on the rise. An election super cycle this year and next year also risk to further destabilize the situation, with more fragmentation and the possible emergence of new populist leaders. Against all these challenges that the region is going to face and is facing, There are solutions, and there is, I guess, every time there is a crisis, there is also opportunity for some improvement and for really rethinking the development model in the region and finding a solution which is more equitable and sustainable. So I'm joined today to discuss all those challenges and hopefully some solution by a great panel of experts and friends, as I mentioned, which I will briefly introduce in order as I see them on the screen. So Andrés Solimano is the founder and chairman of the International Center for Globalization and Development in Santiago, and also an associate professor at the Catholic University of Chile. Welcome, Andrés. Maurício Vieira, who is an assistant professor and chair on countering and preventing illicit trade and transnational organized crime at the University for Peace in Costa Rica. Roxana Maurizio, who is lead labor economist at the International Labour Organization at the regional office for Latin America and the Caribbean. And last but not last, Alejandro Izquierdo, who is the principal technical leader of the research department of the Inter-American Development Bank. Thanks so much for joining us. Just a couple of housekeeping matters before I give the floor to Andrés, I think. We will be giving our speaker the opportunity to give us some introductory remarks, 5-6 minutes each of them. Then we will open the floor for questions. Please engage with us. We have great experts. So if you want to ask a question, you can either do it by the Q&A function in Zoom, or you can raise your hand and we will unmute you and give you the opportunity to interact directly with our speaker. Not that I need to say that, but because by now we all know how to use Zoom very well after years of lockdown. With this, Andrés, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Irene, for the kind invitation to join this seminar. I'm happy also to be surrounded by old friends. It's a good opportunity to exchange on the issues that you have raised on the Southern Cone. Well, here I think since we have a little time allotted to each one, I will try to cover 4 topics in my presentation. One is that to evaluate the situation now in the Southern Cone and prospects ahead, we have to think that the region was already facing complex economic and social political challenges before the COVID crisis hit the region. That's one point. The other is that in general, in my view, the fiscal response to the crisis, I mean the COVID compounded by the economic contraction and the social deterioration, in most of the Southern Cone country has been, I would say, not strong, or more on the weak side, in spite of the announcements of the governments and the amount of money that they say they were mobilizing. The third point that I want to raise is more on the political side or political economy side, that there are some worrisome trends of some return to authoritarian practices, particularly in Chile and Brazil, which I think are worrisome and should be of concern for the international community too. And the fourth point is the need for new economic policies or a new economic and social framework in the years ahead to cope with the COVID now and the post-COVID situation. Let me start with the first point. Well, from 2015-16, the Latin American economy has been experiencing a slowdown in economic growth, a loss of economic dynamism. Countries have, as a whole, and several countries have increased their use of foreign lending to support the domestic economic activity. Fiscal imbalances have worsened in some cases. In general, it was not. It was a worse situation compared with, say, the cycle of 2002, 2003, and 2013 with commodity prices. It was a bad a different phase of the economic cycle before the COVID crisis hit. Then I think in some countries there were political problems, social-political problems. Chile faced a very serious wave of social protest and social demonstration in the last quarter of 2019. Probably the most serious since the wave of protest against the Pinochet regime in the first half of the 1980s. And this protest continued in the beginning of 2020 and then faded away when the COVID crisis hit the country. Well, these protests were faced by very, I would say, strong repression by the Piñera government, which was criticized by International Human Rights Commission that visited the country. But at the same time, Congress agreed on the need of putting a constitutional assembly to draft a new constitution for the country, because Chile is still with the constitution of 1980, approved under the Pinochet regime, with amendments, but the basic constitutional body is that. So Chile was facing a combination of social unrest, the so-called estallido social, before the COVID, and also a slowdown in economic expansion, the rate of economic growth. Argentina was facing also complicated economic problems, I would say, because they were trying austerity policies supported by a big IMF loan of around $60 billion, and trying to implement policies that were also applied in Southern Europe before Greece, Spain, and Portugal, etc. So it was not in a good economic situation. And Brazil was facing more on the political side, a combination of impeachment of former President Dilma Rousseff, the arrest of President Lula da Silva, and he has now been released, I understand, without charge, but he spent several years in prison. And then the election of Bolsonaro, a leader with very similar traits to President Trump in the US. So the country was facing complicated problems too. Situations were less acute in Uruguay and Paraguay. On the second point, what has been the response of the state or the fiscal response, to say, to the combination of economic contraction and the COVID in this region? I think if you go by countries, so let me take just Argentina and Chile, I see that Argentina has been facing restrictions to access to international capital markets. It's engaged in a negotiation with the International Monetary Fund and has been forced or has chosen to monetize the fiscal deficit, so they have an inflation rate over 40% per year. So fiscal expansion has been largely financed through monetary creation and the use of inflation tax, which is not a way that you could say could be sustained, or at least it carries other costs on the side of inflation, particularly. Chile, on the other hand, having sovereign wealth funds and having a relatively easy access to international capital markets, both the private sector and public sector, the government has chosen a sort of self-imposed austerity, and in spite of big numbers announced, the actual increase in public expenditure has not been over 3% of GDP in 2020. Most of the financing of the cash transfer has been relying on the pension funds. People were allowed to withdraw 2 times, in August and then in December, money up to 10% of their holdings of of the AFP, the pension, the privately managed pension funds in Chile. The estimates by the Superintendency of Pension is that near $35 billion have been withdrawn in the two withdrawals. If you compare that with the increase of $5 to $6 billion by the government, you see that most of the financing of the income transfer to face the crisis has relied on the private sector understanding the broad population, okay? And also workers have been forced to withdraw on their labor insurance funds, unemployment insurance funds. In Brazil, the situation perhaps different, but I will skip that. So again, we should evaluate perhaps more carefully what has been the actual, the real fiscal response besides the announcements of the government. And countries here in the Southern Cone have faced different patterns to respond to the crisis. Third, the risk of authoritarian regression, or at least the risk of the democratic system. Because of this crisis, because it's not just a health crisis. I just explained that there has been a latent social protest movement in Chile, and Brazil has faced a complicated institutional crisis before. Argentina managed a more orderly transition from the Macri administration to the Fernandez administration. They face also a score of problems, but probably not a threat to the democratic system. Why I'm thinking in terms of threats? I don't think that there is, you never know in Latin America, they often return to military governments. But we get reports and we read, at least in the press, that the army is taking distances from Bolsonaro, particularly is not very happy the way he has managed the pandemic. So there are some worrisome things there. In Chile, we have been living under state of emergency with curfews and restrictions to mobility due to the pandemic, but also this has helped to curb the social protests that were ongoing right before. So the point is that I mean the government has had a popularity no more than 10% of support on average, more or less, plus minus 10-12%. So it has sustained in the last year and a half through quite harsh action from the national police and held by the state of emergency. And also the situation is that the Constitutional Assembly, we were to have elections for members of the Constitutional Assembly this weekend, and also election for mayors and members of city council, but they were postponed by the government, alluding that there has been an increase in the rate of contagion of the COVID. And now Parliament agreed to hold elections in May. We don't know if will be held in May or not really. The problem I see is that to what extent you can have the deliberation of a constitutional assembly that are expected to last from 9 to 12 months under these conditions of near state of siege, curfews and military control of the cities and the street. I mean, it's not the ideal situation for holding a constitutional assembly. So I just flag this point. I mean, it's something that we have to consider and watch particularly. Well, my last point, because probably I'm running out of time, is I think that we need in the Southern Cone, in Latin America in general, a change in approach in economic policies. We see that, for example, in the US today. Well, I mean, the presidency of Joe Biden is implementing a very strong package of economic stimulus with cash transfers, massive cash transfers $1,500 per person. And then he's going to launch a big push on public investment and an effort to reconvert to the green economy. I mean, this is an extremely interesting set of new developments. And we should watch that in Latin America, in the Southern Cone. Of course, countries have a lower level of per capita income and economic development than the US. Government face different situations for financing, but the approach, I think, there is a need to move away from the tendency, at least in some countries, including mine, from this obsession with permanent austerity, hyper-focalization of social policy, particularly at times of economic emergency, health emergency and economic emergency, the need to set economic floors, probably universal basic income, economic ceilings also, wealth tax, or at least tax to high-income people, and to move to a greater degree of economic democracy, to move away from the policies to the extent policy that dominated since 1990s, the economic neoliberalism, etc. So I think there is a need to fresh thinking of a new economic framework, a new social framework. Take the case of the US. I mean, our countries are becoming, at least some of our countries are becoming too recalcitrant with the approach of the last decades, and need fresh air, and this is a good opportunity to do that. Okay, Irene, I will stop here, and thank you very much for the time allocated.
I think this is a very comprehensive overview, and I guess there'll be quite a lot of debate after, especially on the economic democracy pillar you were mentioning. But moving back to more the political and fragility element in all this crisis, Maurizio, do you want to give us your opening remarks, please?
Thank you, Irene, for your invitation to organize this event. Do you hear me well? Everyone, can you hear me well? Okay. It is very important to discuss the challenges countries face in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and what should be our contribution for diminishing these challenges. And having said that, I would like to start my intervention affirming that we are here discussing stability challenges because there is a high level of unstable contexts posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And when I mention the unstable contexts, I refer to those contexts that evidence some sort of fragility regarding a specific structure of a country. And I do not affirm here that all countries in the Southern Cone are fragile in their totality, but that there are some structures within a country that requires special attention since they are prone for collapsing. And this is one word that is used and is spread in some newspapers, that is the collapse of the health system. In this regard, the concept of fragility becomes an important one since it enables us to understand not only what the challenge is about, but why this challenge acts as a spillover effect, affecting other sectors in a country. And in a nutshell, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic evidenced that some necessary measures to counter the spread of the virus were neglected, which can be exemplified by discrediting science and the protocols for individual and collective protection, such as wearing a mask and adopting social distance. And the absence of such measures, which I call as narrative, during this pandemic, adopted by some countries during the COVID-19 pandemic, had two direct consequences. First, it went against the avoidance of the collapse of the health system. And second, this narrative negatively impacted on the social and political stability of a country. And here lays the fragility as an ongoing process of threatening the social and political structure. Fragility works against the recovery process that is required for building stabilization when the pandemic achieves a level of control. What is expected? Embedded in this perspective on fragility and on the report published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, I would like to highlight 3 points. First, The instability in a country within the pandemic context can be measured by the negative socioeconomic factors it generates. And for socioeconomic factors, I mentioned the ones that report evidences to us, such as poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Second, the instability evidenced by the pandemic intensifies problems that were already there, such as the risks of a high level of non-violence rates, the increasing of the global illicit trade, the increasing on health-based corruption cases, and social volatility. It is important to emphasize here that the most vulnerable people are who suffer the consequence of the pandemic most, which evidences social discrepancies. And third, the instability evidenced by the pandemic is an indicator of where lays the fragility in a country. And the fragility is there when the social safety nets are not enhanced, when institutions are discredited for not playing their role to minimize the social and economic collapse and human suffering caused by the pandemic, and when the state is not only the actor responsible for the high level of structural violence against its inhabitants, but that the state is also incapable for delivering positive political goods to them. And when it provides, the goods are not fair. And with these 3 points for reflection and for discussion, I conclude my introductory intervention, looking forward to improving our thoughts and ideas on fragility within the pandemic context. Thank you, Irene.
Thanks, Maurizio. It was fascinating. I hope we'll have time to discuss more this concept of fragility in the context of COVID. Roxana, looking at one of the big fragility, like labor market in Latin America, can you tell us what you think? I know you want to share some slides. Yes. You're on mute, Roxana.
Okay, sorry. First of all, thank you so much, Irene, for inviting me to be part of this very interesting panel. My idea is to talk about the impact of the pandemic on Latin American labor market, and in particular, the impact on labor market and income distribution in the South American countries. So my idea is to talk about the main trends regarding this impact of the pandemic on labor market, and then to discuss, or at least to mention the different areas where I consider it is important to move forward in this region, especially in this context. So let me start talking about showing the impact of this crisis on economic in this region. As we know, the pandemic, the COVID-19 has generated an economic crisis of unprecedented intensity, magnitude, and characteristics. Even in a region already characterized by the very strong macroeconomic crisis. For instance, in the graph on the left, we can see different important crises during the last 70 years in the region. And even if we compare the current crisis with the debt crisis at the beginning of the 80s, for instance, or the international crisis in 2008, 2009, we can observe the magnitude of the current crisis. And in particular, considering that the GDP in 2020 is estimated around 7% or even higher, 7.7%. But in this general overview, we can observe in some countries, such as Argentina, for instance, where the GDP growth, the fall in the GDP was around 10% last year. In the graph on the right, we can observe in more detail the evolution of the level of activity along the whole year, along the 2020. And we can observe two different phases. The first one during mainly the first and the second quarter of 2020, where we can observe the strong impact of the crisis on economic activity in the region, and in particular in these countries, and then the second phase of the partial recovery of this previous impact. This is important in order to contextualize the impact of this crisis on the evolution, the behavior of labor market in the regions. And in particular, considering this very important impact of the macroeconomic crisis, we can observe also a very important negative impact on job creation, on employment, unemployment, and level of labor and participation. And in particular, the employment rate fell about 10% last year, even more than the decrease in the GDP rate. So we are talking about a very special crisis regarding the impact on Latin American labor market. Here we can observe the evolution, the drop in the employment rate between 2019 and 2020, especially between the first and the second quarter of last year. But we can also observe an unusual impact of this crisis, or unusual consequence of this reduction in employment rate, because unlike previous crises, we observe in this crisis, especially between the first and the second quarter of 2020, a very important decrease in the participation rate. That is to say, the job losses translated into massive outflows from the labor force. Around 80% of total losses translated in transitions out of the labor force. These transitions, of course, mitigated the impact of job loss on unemployment. But even in this case, we can observe an increase in unemployment rate between these 2 years, especially again between the first and the second quarter of this year, and then a partial recovery during the second part of this year. But even more important another important indicator of the labor market, because again, we can observe a different behavior in the labor market in this special crisis, is the behavior of informality along the year, along this crisis, because usually informality behaves countercyclically. That is to say, when we observe a decrease in the formal jobs, in general, we observe at the same time an increase in informality. But in this special context, in this special crisis, we can observe a different behavior of informal jobs. We observed especially during the first half of the year, a reduction in formal employment, but also with more intensity, a reduction in informal occupation. As a result, as we can see in the graph on the left, we observe we have a decrease in the informality rate. That is to say, a decrease in the proportion of informal employment in total employment. This is the first part of the year. But when we look at the second part of the year, the recovery of employment, it is interesting to note that in this recovery phase, the employment has been almost completely led by the increase in informal jobs, as we can see in the graph on the right. This is interesting because this is important, because it was associated first with the return of those people who lost informal job and left the labor market during the first part of the year, but also we are observing nowadays that there is a informalization of informal employment in a region, as you, Irene, mentioned, characterized by high level of informality. So this is an important aspect of this crisis. But also it is interesting to note that this crisis has generated very important widening of gender gaps. It was associated first with a stronger impact of female employment during the first part of the year, the first part of 2020. As we can see in the evolution of employment rate during, for instance, during the first and the second quarter, it is clear that the reduction in female employment was stronger than in male employment. But also important is to consider that this reduction in employment among women implied that around 20 million women lost their jobs during 2020. But even more important is to note that this reduction in employment rate generated an historical setback in the female labor force participation. For instance, if we consider the regional participation labor force of women in 2020, the level of the rate of participation is similar to the level in 15 years ago. So this is a very important setback in the female labor participation force. But even more worrying is the context when we analyze the second half of the year, the recovery process, because the increase in employment was stronger in the case of men than in the case of women. So this is why we can observe a very important widening of a gender gap. Even more important is the current situation, because the new wave of contagions and the new measures to contain them can also have a strong impact on sectors with a very high female presence. So again, we can observe a new way of the widening of these gaps between men and women. As a consequence of this impact, considering that the reduction of employment was stronger among informal workers, among women, among less skilled workers, it is clear that this crisis has generated very unequalizing impact, especially if we consider that we are talking about a region where about 80 or 90% of total family incomes come from the labor market. So here, for instance, we can see just two examples, but the similar situation is found in other Latin American countries. Here we have the variation, the negative variation, the reduction in real per capita family incomes along the distribution, and it is clear that the reduction in these family incomes was stronger in at the bottom part of the income distribution in comparison with the upper part of the income distribution. So let me conclude by mentioning at least 4 areas where I consider 4 type of labor and income policies, labor market and income policies that I consider very important to discuss and very important for the region to move forward. The first one, it is clear in this context that the region, and in particular the South American countries, has to move forward in a greater income support in the face of job loss, especially for informal workers. Second, it is important to discuss and to implement a very comprehensive set of different policies and strategies to support a process of labor formalization. There is a key role for active labor policies, in particular those associated with skills, especially in the context of digital transition. And finally, it was very clear in this context that the region and these countries in particular needed to advance, needed to increase the provision of public child care services, and also, of course, public, of course, and child care services and elderly care services. This was very evident that they needed to advance in these topics. So it is important, as already mentioned, this is the opportunity to discuss about the comprehensive system of different labor policies and income policies to support especially informal workers or most vulnerable workers and families. So thank you so much. I will stop here.
Thanks, Roxana. That was great. I think it's a great way to actually give us an agenda for what should be done to address the labor market fragility, which is really one of the fragility elements that Maurizio hinted before. Alejandro, you are the last one, and I know that you have a strategy to get out of this. So please go ahead.
Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation, Irene and IISS. It's a pleasure to be here. All the previous speakers have made it a lot easier for me because now you have the framework and the setup where the region stands. What I'll be drawing on to for the presentation is from a report that we wrote last year on a strategy for the region. And I will be using all along the analogy of a tunnel. No? So imagine that the region entered a tunnel after the COVID started, which is a tunnel full of uncertainty, because we don't know how long it will be, how long until we have access, generalized access to vaccines, and the virus is over. But there's certainty that when we get out of this tunnel, the region is going to be poorer, more indebted, and more unequal. So those things we know. And as Andrés was mentioning at the very beginning, we entered the tunnel in a very dire situation because we were already facing deep problems. And so when it rains, it pours in a way. Just to give you a few examples, Argentina, Latin America's income per capita has remained more or less around 20% of US income per capita since the 1960s, and we have not converged. If you compare that with East Asia, for example, they've now reached 50% of US's per capita GDP. So a stagnant region with little growth. And even though we had made strides in inequality, we still have sub-Saharan African levels on average. And the crisis made it even worse. A survey we made last year, and this is consistent with what Roxana was saying, 80% of households in the lowest income deciles lost their jobs at the start of the crisis, whereas only 20% of individuals in the highest decile suffered a similar fate. So definitely this won't help in terms of income distribution. And also, when you look at the fiscal side of our economies, we were already facing deficits in the order of 3% of GDP, which have ballooned all the way to 9% of GDP. So the region has a restricted ability to respond compared to developed countries. So when we entered the tunnel, we faced what we call a triple sudden stop of people, goods, and financial flows, which made it very, very difficult at the beginning. And if you add to that we had very strict confinement measures, but with little testing and monitoring capacity, as Maurizio was pointing, and also the stories about the non-existence of the virus in some countries, that led to the worst of both worlds, if you want, because not only did the economy collapse, 7% of GDP at least on average, but debts. With only 8% of the world's population, we got 27% of world debts. So really, really the bad quadrant, if you want, in terms of output and health. So with all these challenges, going back to the strategies we had in the past won't be enough. What we suggest is that the region should think about a new social contract. Because contracts before the region were obsolete or broken, as Andrés was very nicely pointing. And so we have now, perhaps of some success we had in the 2000s, we have a new middle class with strong demands, and it's not receiving the services from the public sector that it was hoping to get. So what should this new social contract have? The ingredients we think should be put into two buckets. I mean, the first one is more opportunity for sustained growth, and the other one is more equity. So it takes two to tango. You have to give more opportunities, but at the same time, you have to make those opportunities be equitable. So to describe the analogy of the tunnel, let me quickly introduce a slide that I would like to share with you. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, I hope you can see it now. And here, what I want to discuss is the fact that we've entered this pandemic tunnel, and we know when we started, but we don't know when we have the final mass vaccination, which would be the exit. And here I want to describe the sets of policies we think that should be carried out. everybody has focused on limiting losses. No? And that's great. I mean, preservation policies that will take care of people, of jobs and firms, and of course health, no, which is the primary component here. But and that will give you the better you do this, the more you limit the losses, the better will be the starting point at the end of the tunnel. But I think that, and most countries have this completely out of the radar, I think we also have to be thinking about reforms to grow more. As I said, if we're going to get more indebted, poorer, and more unequal, if we don't manage ways to grow more at the end of this tunnel, it's going to be very tough. And so these policies have a feedback effect, because if you limit your losses, you're fine, you'll get a better starting point. But if you start now with reforms to grow more, you will definitely also change expectations for the future to the extent that these reforms that you announce are credible. And that will give you better resources today, because markets will open up to finance more, even despite the fact that you have a fiscal situation that may be difficult. So those two are important. I would say everybody's missing number two, except for a few countries. Perhaps one good example in the Southern Cone is Paraguay. But I mean, they've been thinking about reforms for a long time now. I mean, a couple of years ago, I was able to talk to a group of ministers in the expenditure committee who basically took it seriously that we need reform in terms of the fiscal expenditure, and also the playground, for the private sector. And they introduced a lot of reforms that they're now putting up to Congress to decide. So definitely a strategy to think about. Now, going back to what the public sector should do, I think that there are two things that governments need to do. First, they will have to have a very, very precise timing in terms of how they reallocate expenditure. I told you that we were coming from a very difficult fiscal position, and I know Andrés is worried about that we become too stringent with this, and he's right. But some countries, I mean, have it, according to our estimates, the region may reach debt levels which will be in the neighborhood of 80% of GDP by 2022. So that will definitely put some pressure. And one thing that we recommend is that as much as you can, if you have fiscal space, you switch from COVID expenditures now in the tunnel to pro-growth expenditures out of the tunnel. And for those countries that really don't have the fiscal space, they should think about ways to make room for pro-growth spending. And there are several areas that could be a lot more efficient in terms of expenditure. We've identified three. One of them is government procurement, which tends to be subject to corruption or badly organized schemes. Also, the fact that until recently, at least, particularly for low skills, public sector wages have been higher than private sector wages in many cases. And the third one is that, of course, we need to focus, I mean, to provide more transfers for those in need. But currently, there are a lot of what's the word? Improper targeting of many of these transfers. For example, one of the worst of all is when we do tax expenditures. For example, on the value-added tax, we lower the value-added tax of food, for example, thinking that we're making making it easier for the poor because food is big in their basket. But when you take a look at the overall size of the tax expenditure, about 70% goes to the non-poor only because they consume more. So we suggest changing, for example, that from that tax subsidy to a general tax which covers everybody, and then you go back through income and precisely give the income to those individuals in need, you know? And that saves you a lot of money. So that's the type of things that should be done. No? In the short run, I mean, what's the timing, no, of all these very difficult clockwork engineering that governments will have to work on? Well, in the short run, we should be switching, no, from this preservation to pro-growth expenditure, particularly, I think, in sustainable digital infrastructure, which we know has been lacking for decades in the region, and it has a very large multiplier. No? Studies we've done at IDB show that the multiplier of expenditure can be as high as 2. So for every dollar you spend on infrastructure, you get 2 in output. No? So definitely something to think about. And also, the other aspect that is really, really important in the short run is to think about how to make the labor market work again. No? And Roxana was pointing very precisely to the issue of informality, no, that is rampant in the region. So we believe that if we could somehow engineer a reduction in non-salary labor costs, no, so that we can promote new hires in the formal sector, that may be a way to start. Of course, it's not for free. You have to think how you're going to finance that. That's why I think making room in inefficient expenditure to finance this type of expenditure is definitely the way to go, because we will have to give a response to labor markets. And then there's, in the report we mentioned, for the medium term, a long set of potential reforms. Of course, for each country, there will be different reforms that are more relevant, no? For each particular country. But one of them is, for example, think about spending those savings on quality health and education to boost human capital, particularly for low-income groups. Think of unemployment insurance mechanisms. I mean, we don't have unemployment insurance mechanisms in the region that work, and definitely shocks will keep on coming. So that's something that we have to think about. How to foster private investment, reduce tariffs in capital goods to bring foreign direct investment in, and then also think about how we're going to deal with some of the problems left by the COVID-19 crisis, like the regulation for the liquidation of firms, which is quite, I mean, it's not fast in the region, it moves very slowly. Credit for new investments and reducing barriers to entry of firms. I could go on, but let me stop here and then we can take questions.
That's great. Thanks so much, Alejandro. I think it's lots of practical ideas and practical actually steps to take. So I have quite a number of questions, but I just want to open the floor for questions if there is any question. So if anyone wants to ask a question, just raise the hand. In the meantime, maybe I will do one of my questions, leveraging the time I have. So, I mean, I think we know what should be done. I think there is a roadmap that Alejandro have highlighted very well, and Roxana as well, in terms specifically for the labor market. I guess my question for all of you would be, what do you think is the outlook for implementing this kind of reforms and this kind of policies? When one think what Andrés was highlighting, the fact that the political environment and the quality of the institutional setting is actually quite probably in a worse state than in the past. You know, with election, we have some populist tendency all over the region, and also I guess the demand from the civil society maybe point also to a bigger state, right? Because we were all quite taken aback by how COVID impacted the society. So what do you think is the outlook? Do you think, are you optimistic? What do you think would be the priority if we had to choose a priority? Who wants to answer?
I can start if you want. I mean, that's a great question, Irene, because this sounds like a very nice strategy, but then comes the political economy of it and destroys it all. Let me say a couple of things about this. The first is, I think the longer we wait, the higher the chances that this window of opportunity for reform will go away. Because when you're in the middle of a crisis, people usually have this sense that we need to change and that we need to do something different. But then as things keep going and the economy somehow recovers and you have a sense of normality, then you say, well, let me fight for my rights, let me fight for what I have, and then everybody starts fighting for their own benefits, and that's when you lose the opportunity. So definitely the sooner the better, because otherwise people get organized and then everything goes back to the status quo.
Anyone else? Andrés, I know you have an answer.
Well, no, I would say, no, I agree with Alejandro. That now there is a window of opportunity that may not be tomorrow. So this the opportunity. It's important to seize this juncture to do reforms. I think, well, there has been a perennial problem of how to build effective, efficient state in Latin America, always with improvement and then failures, and as Alejandro was showing, the region is not converging internationally in terms of per capita income, at least with the US showing that it faces structural problems to do reforms and for economic development to take off. It's not just a junction of 1 or 2 years. Now, I think the government should put up certain priorities. I think, of course, now the health sector is absolutely essential, that governments increase expenditure and spend the money in building hospitals, getting vaccines. I mean, something that whether produced domestically, I mean, that Chile used to have a capacity to produce domestic vaccines, and then they took it away because everything had to be imported. I mean, this was this fever of that you have to buy things where they are less expensive, which is reasonable, but at the same time, you have to consider risks. Sometimes you cannot buy internationally what you need, and perhaps you need to start producing them at home. So building capacities to produce vaccine is an obvious example. Also, hospitals. I mean, with the COVID, most of hospitals in the country, at least in Chile and other countries, I assume, are operating in full capacity for intensive care. I mean, if people arrive, they have to wait, and in most dramatic cases, Brazil, that many people are dying because they don't have access to. There are no more beds in intensive care in hospital, and this probably is the result of years of underinvestment in public health infrastructure in the country and several other countries. So I would start with very basic things. Also build a social protection system that is effective. Even you have countries that have fiscal space, but they don't want to use it because they are still stuck with too many previous, asking people to many previous conditions to receive the money. You have to show that you were under lockdown for 2 weeks and that you had a reduction in income of 20%. You have to show paper that document that you had a loss of income. But as Roxana was showing, most of the people now are in the informal sector. They don't, they operate under no contract. They have no way to show their fall in income. At least this is the practice in Chile now. I mean, the project of Bono de la Clase Media, it requests so many conditions that I don't know how many people would be able to do that. So I would start with very reasonable things, an important thing in the health sector and unlock the social safety networks. Because governments are too obsessed, at least in some countries, that try not to give money that people supposedly don't need it, that leave a big numbers of people without receiving cash transfer that really do need. Now, this is an important question you are posing, Irene.
And I just a related question, which has to do with informality and also the fact that obviously I was highlighting the impact on the labor market being really strong. And I guess the question for Maurizio more than obviously everybody's welcome to react. But where does crime, organized crime, and criminality has been a perennial problem for the region? Where does this pandemic leave us with respect to crime? And what is, and I guess that's one of the fragility. How do we, what should we do to address that, Maurizio?
Thank you, Irene, for your question. This is a very important one. And in my perspective, I think that the organized crime exists and is still strong because it occupies a space where lays the state fragility. For example, specific border rules and where the state is absent for providing political goods for its inhabitants. And for example, but in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that organized crime finds a solid terrain on the one hand, on the supplies for vaccine, and on the other hand, on the collective need for vaccination. And in both cases, I think that there's a high level of demand for social needs, and this opens space for new forms of illicit trade and product falsification. And also one thing that we could not forget on this dynamic is the level of corruption, especially health-based corruption cases. But I just want to add, if you allowed me, that is aligned to what Andrés has said before in this kind of solutions. I think that I think that countries must think on what should be the political priority, especially for policies for health assistance, but also to have a culture of prevention and crisis management. And I think also one thing that you bring in the report that is related to the culture of graduating citizens. And graduating citizens, I mean that those citizens that are benefited by social programs as Bolsa Familia, for example, they could not be dependent for long period of time to the state. But so I think that this is a process of improving this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess what, and that's more question for you, Roxana, what you were mentioning, the active labor policy, which should go hand in hand with obviously support in the short term. I'd like to ask you a question, which is probably of interest for our audience, just to conclude, given we are already running out of time. Is there, I mean, Alejandro has already mentioned the case of Paraguay, but is there any country where we can look at for inspiration, especially for labor market reforms in the region?
Yes, I agree with Andrés and Alejandro regarding the need to set priorities. No, in particular in the labor market, for instance, Alejandro mentions unemployment insurance, and regarding this point, there are discussions about how to change or how to increase the coverage of unemployment insurance, covering other group of workers, for instance, independent workers, or how to allow this kind of instrument to cover different situations more than the unemployment. For instance, during this crisis, people were able to use unemployment insurance to cover the reduction in working hours or another event, not only unemployment itself. So this is an important experience during last years, and currently they are Paraguay, Uruguay, Chile, they are discussing how to increase the impact and the coverage of this instrument. And this is very important because, as mentioned before by Alejandro, this is an existent, in fact, instrument in the labor market. And this is even more important in this context, but this is important considering the high employment and macroeconomic instability that characterize Latin America. And so we need some kind of automatic stabilizer as in Europe in order to reduce the impact of this crisis on the labor market and the reverse impact from the labor market to macroeconomic indicators. So this is one important point. This is a key policy in terms of labor market, and nowadays there are very interesting discussion and very interesting initiatives in order to improve the functioning of this instrument. At the same time, the combination of unemployment, the pure unemployment insurance with a more active labor market, this is another point. And finally, the connection, as mentioned by Andrés, the connection between social policies, cash transfers. In the region, we have a lot of different experiences about these cash transfers. So nowadays, it is important to discuss the role of these social cash transfers and how to combine these cash transfers, especially conditional cash transfers, to more labor active policies. So I think that in this crisis, we needed to use this crisis in order to move forward, not only to implement new policies, but also to set a coherent system of different policies, labor policies, but in combination with social policies. And also, in the end, we needed to create more and better jobs. And the issue of productivity is crucial in this point. The region needed to increase the productivity in order to be able to create more jobs, and even more important, more better jobs.
Yeah, and on this note, I think unfortunately we have to close the webinar because we're already running late. But I think it's we have a roadmap. I guess there are lots of there is a succession of policies and a combination of policies which should be adopted. And I think the roadmap is there. My concern is more whether we have the right level of government efficiency and also political will to do that. But I guess we will see how there are elections happening this year, next year. There are constitutional assemblies being formed in Chile, hopefully at some point. That's a subject for another webinar. But I just want to thank you very much, Maurizio, Roxana, Alejandro, and Andrés. It was great having you in our webinar, and we hope to have you in some other webinar. And I think this was a good way to start the agenda for the IISS on Latin America. And on a note, just to let you know that the webinar is going to be it's being recorded, so we'll post it on our website. Please also tune in next week for our webinar of the Conflict Security and Development Program on Mozambique, which is going to be quite an interesting one, very timely. And thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye.